Okay, so moving forward on this Industria and Sustainia. In the last podcast, I said I didn't know if Industria was coined by Gellner, who used the word Agraria for the period before Industria. Turns out that Gellner, in fact, did use that word in his 1989 treatise on, various issues, politics, governance, and such. He's a very influential author that you can read about. So coming back to here, unfolding Sustainia, the proposed start of the Anthropocene in the mid-20th century coincides with the establishment of environmental issues on the global policy agenda, epitomized by the 1972 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm and the following string of Earth summits that ended up in Stockholm again in 2022 that we looked at. Sustainability is now a central connecting aspect in several previously separate policy areas, most clearly visible in the Sustainable Development Goals for 2015 to 2030. They were called Millennium Goals before that, and now we are constantly worrying about whether we are on track to meet the sustainability goals by 2030 and whether adaptation, mitigation, and so on, economic development, sustainability, net zero, decarbonization, whether they are all also serving the sustainable development goals or not. The outcome documents from these global processes request a balance between production and conservation to safeguard sustainable development for both present and future generations. When contrasting that with the contemporary society, it becomes clear that the envisioned society is so fundamentally different it may be considered a distinct kind of society. If that vision cannot be considered Industria anymore, let's call it Sustainia. So this is the author's contribution to the jargon, even though he said he doesn't like name changes just for the sake of it. For Gellner 1989, the central theme of life in Agraria is predation with elaborate coercive schemes to redistribute wealth. In Industria, on the other hand, production has replaced predation and power shifted from feudal masters to a more homogeneous population of relatively flexible functional specialists. So we evolved all the engineering disciplines, medicine, lawyers, and production and distribution, retail, consumption, etc. produced a lot of employment, and agriculture grew, green revolution came along, and so on. Production is still hegemonic in contemporary society, but it's increasingly challenged by preservation, the central theme of life in the vision of Sustainia. It's at best a gradual change, and perhaps preservation never surpasses production, at least if we are to believe the more cynical observers like Zizek. However, the shift from predation to production was also gradual, opposed by established elites and full turmoil and setbacks, as Gellner points out again. But also, we are now in this loop of sustainability and what's called circular economy, where things are supposed to be produced, and by the end of the life cycle they're supposed to be reintegrated into the production system. So production is bad, as Herman Daly would point out, that if you're converting natural resources irreversibly and irrecyclably into junk, then obviously economic growth is taking over the ecosystem. But if sustainability is doing things in a way where we are not converting things to junk that will just stay in landfills or elsewhere, piling up and not to be recycled, then obviously Sustainia is not going to happen. So humankind is in dire need of a new great revolution, as Industria has led us into a developmental cul-de-sac, dead end. Although preservation appears to become increasingly central in the scientific and policy dialogues of the Anthropocene, it's impossible to ascertain if we are in a new great revolution. We are moving towards renewable energy, EVs, decarbonization, carbon capture, but is it amounting to a revolution that will actually save us? Not clear. Nobody could anticipate our previous great transformation beforehand, whilst they appear obvious in hindsight. However, Remember Gellner's warning in chapter 2 that people tend to take their institutions and assumptions as absolute, self-evident, and beyond question, actively fortifying them against any potential challenge. So we are handicapping them in terms of flexibility and change. If we are in a new great revolution, it is also impossible to ascertain if it would take us to Sustainia or somewhere else. Well, if the somewhere else is all about decarbonizing, then I'm all for it, as long as biodiversity and other things are also being protected. However, it's essential to engage in critical dialogue concerning contemporary institutions and assumptions and inquire resolutely into current changes and their potential resultant direction. Not that we can engineer social change with any precision, but we must still push for what we think can help the sustainability of humankind and against what we see as a continuation towards doom. So this doom loop scenarios are discussed all the time. Moving forward, investigating changes in production, cognition, and coercion, Gellner focuses on the three central features of production, cognition, and coercion when elaborating on the fundamental differences between hunter-gatherer, agrarian, and industrial societies. Right? We went with one revolution from agrarian hunter-gatherers to agrarians, caused by climate change, ice age melting away, and so on. And then industrial societies came up more, as a surprise with all the innovations happening. So we went from Stone Age to Bronze Age and iron, and then we came into Industrial Revolution. Perhaps we can also find hints of a new great revolution in these features of social life. But by definition, these are tipping points that cannot be predicted or foreseen very well, even though many books like Orwell's 1984 and Arthur Clarke and many science fiction writers had imagined the great computers, handheld computers, mobile phones, and so on and so forth. Numerous social scientists study changes in production in the Anthropocene. Schneiberg's treadmill of production and Moll and Spargin's work on ecological modernization theory are compelling examples of changes in perspectives on production. So again, these are kind of guesses about where things are going. There are also several new forms of production being suggested and advocated, such as not-for-profit social enterprises, ethical organizations, open source, crowdsourcing, fair trade, and microfinance. All of these are playing out, but not clear if human systems are going to be perfect in any sense. But AI is now playing a bigger and bigger role in the debates about what AI will do for us and how AI may take over and destroy things and so on and so forth. So more and more examples of radically different institutions and organizations have become central and in many ways influential, such as Wikipedia, Linux, which is already old, OpenStreetMap, and Patagonia. The owner handed over the big business to non-profits or environmental activists. Although these alternative forms of production are all still dwarfed by conventional capitalism, they may constitute hints of potential transformation towards Sustainia. But on the other hand, if capitalism is something that is most consistent with human innovation ability, then maybe capitalism itself is producing solutions for decarbonization, carbon-free energy, and sustainable lifestyles, right? So capitalism may not be something that we need to throw out, baby with the bathwater kind of metaphor. So it's important to note that all modern states have traded economic growth against environmental degradation, regardless of the regime type, which we'll see in a prop. Our sustainability challenges would, in other words, have been much the same if state socialism had become the dominant mode of production instead of capitalism. So Marxism wouldn't have succeeded, which it didn't, because maybe capitalism is consistent with human innovation, and democracy, as imperfect as it tends to be, is the nirvana for governing. However, production is arguably the central element of Gellner's 1989 explanation for our previous great transformations. Therefore, it's fair to assume that production changes may also be central in the next, especially since it is Industria's kind of production that underlies our current sustainability challenges. So everything comes down to being so carbon dependent, being in a carbon trap, and I have podcasts on carbon trap and decarbonization as a paradigm instead of emissions reductions. So it's not necessarily the Industria's kind of production, but it is that all our energy and everything else is carbon based. Latour even argues that we need not only to modify the current production system, but to get out of it altogether, which I would call decarbonization, reminding us that framing everything in terms of the economy is a new idea in human history. Okay, so this is 16.3. The shrinking of Aral Sea happened during both the communist regime of the Soviet Union and the capitalist regimes of most countries in its catchment area. So that's a tragic situation. There are many other water bodies like Lake Chad, Nile, Lake Victoria, and so on have had massive impacts by human activities as well. Should I keep going? Maybe it's a good point to stop and come back to more discussion on Gellner in the next podcast. This one is already about 11.5 minutes long, so that's a good place to stop as well, since I have to also get a sip of water. It's still very hot and humid here, even though we are not in a heat wave, but March, April, May in Mumbai are hot and humid, so normal. Okay, see you in the next podcast.